Good morning. This is the YouTube channel Faith Seeking Understanding. I'm Alan Bevere, pastor, professor, and lover of barbecue. And I say that this morning in particular reference to our guest, Michael Kruse, who actually lives in Kansas City. And actually a few years ago when I was out there, Michael, you and I shared some barbecue together over lunch, which was wonderful. Michael Kruse is our guest today, and I want to interview him on the numbers and the economics of this current time, get some of his insights. Michael, I want to tell the folks why I wanted to interview you, but first, could you give us a little information about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Mike Kruse. I live in Kansas City, Missouri. Big lover of barbecue. During this whole crisis, I've been working very hard to keep my local barbecue joint, visiting them at least once a week for takeout. So I'm doing my part to keep the economy going. My background, I have an education, graduate degree in sociology, which emphasized demographic studies, and then also have an MBA in economic development. Had a lifelong interest in socioeconomic issues. How does economics impact society and human well-being? And I've worked in nonprofit organizations, worked for United Way for a few years as a research analyst. I worked in a business situation where we were attempting to start a company there that did, this is right before the internet, but we basically were doing competitive intelligence information on other businesses. So researching that type of information. And then I've also been actively involved in the world of the church. I've served as various capacities throughout my denomination, Presbyterian Church USA, over the past several years. And so sort of have my feet in all those different worlds. And I don't consider myself to be an expert either in economics or in epidemiology, but they are obviously topics that are of great concern to people who are concerned about socioeconomic issues. So I follow them quite regularly and try to keep up to date.
Yeah, and the main reason I wanted to interview you on this, and every time I ask you a question about economics, the first thing you always say is, I'm not an economist. So exactly. I appreciate your desire to set those boundaries, which some people don't seem to understand. Somebody is an expert on everything. There are people who are experts on everything. So I appreciate your humility in that. But one of the reasons I wanted to interview you is I have read the stuff you've posted over the years, and it's very clear to me that you certainly, in conjunction with demographics, in conjunction with other things, sociologically, you clearly are able to discern what it is that you read and take in. And also the one thing I've appreciated about you is you really drill down through the numbers. You're able to take all these numbers and help clarify for some of us who are, as I like to say, numerically challenged. And so I've always really appreciated your wisdom on that. So that's why I wanted to interview you, particularly on this. So let me ask you first, I want to get to the economics of this, but first I just want to talk about COVID-19 in general and the pandemic. It's clear to me from what you posted that you are not a believer that this is just the flu, that we're overreacting, as some people are saying. What is it that leads you to see this for the seriousness that it is in a way that is unprecedented, at least in the last century?
In the last century, sure. Well, this is a virus, and we know how viruses have operated in the past. Each virus is different. It has different features to it. And at the beginning, when a virus is starting, we really don't know what all the specifics are. So there's an element of risk involved. Risk always involves the aspects of, is something likely to happen? And then it also involves, if it does happen, how serious will it be? So something that has a high probability of happening but isn't very serious, we don't worry about. Something that may be very serious but a relatively low possibility may still be concerning, because if it happens, it can be really dangerous. So with a virus, we're trying to understand how serious it is and what our risk factors are. I think maybe one way to start this in terms of concern and how I see this going is, we know where most viruses end. We know what the end of the story is. Eventually, at some point, you reach a herd immunity where you have enough people that have been exposed to the virus and have developed immunity, or through a vaccine, some combination of the two. You get to a point where the virus no longer is able to have an impact. Viruses have to spread from one person to another, and eventually, if they start spreading through most of the community, they have no new victims to grab. So at some point, you get to the end of that. Now, some viruses, they can reemerge at later times, and maybe they won't be as virulent as they were in the first rounds, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's completely over. But in terms of, I think, the broad economic impact and having something like we're having now, most viruses are going to be, over the course of a couple years, usually, they're going to have run their course when we get to that. So the question is, this space in between when the virus emerges and we get to that point, what happens in between then? They talk about in epidemiology something called the R naught. The R naught is, if I become infected, how many other people am I likely to infect? Just with a random, with no remediation to the situation, how many people am I likely to affect? So with the measles, the typical person with measles likely infects up to 18 other people at the time that they have it. With the flu, I think it's something like 1.5, somewhere in that range, 1.5 people. And what happens is the higher that number is, the more rapidly, obviously, the infections spread. And then you look at the fatality rate, the number of people that die once they're infected. If you start having a whole bunch of people getting infected very quickly, and you have a relatively high fatality rate or even hospitalization rate, then you quickly overwhelm the medical care services. And if medical care services can't be provided, that further limits the ability to limit the fatality rate, because people are using those services. Healthcare workers are getting ill, so they can't provide those services. Meanwhile, people with other situations, other illnesses that could have been treated, they also are not receiving treatment because the medical services have been overwhelmed. And so you have an escalating fatality rate. So the idea then is, we know we're going to go through this virus to at some point where you get to the end where you've got a herd immunity. But the idea is to get there in a way that minimizes the number of deaths as much as possible and does it in a manageable way, manageable way. So what is the herd immunity for this disease? And we don't know exactly. We simply don't have enough information. Most officials would say that it's probably, the R naught is probably about 2 or 3. In other words, if I get infected, I'm likely to infect 2 to 3 other people. And when you calculate that, if the R naught is 2, then that means herd immunity is 50%. So basically 50% of the population. If the R naught is 3, then it's probably closer to 70% of the population where you got to have herd immunity. And if the fatality rate is, say, 1% of that, half the population, so what would that be? 160, 175,000 people in the United States. You take half of that, that means 1.6 to 2 million people, depending on if it's 2 or 3, that would die from that if we just let things run its course. So are there ways that we can slow down that to make sure we provide the optimal care possible to reduce that? So that's where I think we're headed. So I want to get that up front, that we know where this ends essentially. So the question is this thing is it as deadly as advertised? And again, I state with all sorts of qualifications, we don't know the final numbers yet, so we don't know at the end. The question is there a risk, a significant risk? And I think there is. If you look at the number of deaths that have occurred on up to a particular date in the year for many regions around the United States, and you compare that to the number of deaths that have occurred this year where there are hotspots, you see significant spikes in the number of deaths. Those numbers stay pretty constant, pretty similar from year to year, and what you're seeing are spikes. And if you look at the number of COVID-19 deaths, the number of deaths that have been officially attributed to COVID-19 in those areas, they usually only account for about half to maybe 2/3 of the deaths that are there, which means there are deaths that are probably not even being factored into the official count. So today, I think we're talking about 75,000 deaths that are officially being, that we're saying people have died. That's probably over 100,000. In reality, could be even higher. And that to me is the most solid indicator that we're dealing with something that is certainly more deadly than the flu. I don't want to just keep talking here.
No, well, it just leads to one question, actually more than one, but let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
So I take it you would disagree with those who say we're overcounting the cases.
Yeah, I don't think that you could say that we're overcounting. When you look at those numbers, compared the number of deaths to date to the number of deaths that are happening in these hot spots, there's obviously a spike. There's no other reason for the spike other than the COVID-19 in those regions. So those deaths are, they're part of the problem with people claiming that there is an overcount is they talk about a death being caused either directly by a disease, or they talk about comorbidity. Comorbidity meaning it's a contributing factor. That's always been the case in death counts, whatever death you're looking at, whether it's flu or anything else. The interesting comparison to me about the flu death count, people will say, I think Bill Bennett was saying a couple of weeks ago that only 60,000 people died from the flu, and only 60,000 people have died from COVID-19, so it's no worse than the flu. Well, the point wasn't, we weren't doing what we were doing because 60,000 people were going to die from COVID-19. We were doing that to limit it to 60,000 people dying from COVID-19. Now, people want to debate, well, we really didn't say that. Okay, well, whatever. The point is that was the purpose of it. And so to say that it's the same count doesn't make any difference. The other thing that I would, actually a couple other things, to look at the COVID-19 deaths today, comparing that to entire flu season, I'm using that like looking at a baseball player and looking at his total strikeout record from last season. And then 2 months into this season, looking at his strikeouts, finding out he has the same strikeouts this year that he had all of last season, and saying, well, see, it's no different. He's doing the same this season as he did last season. We aren't to the end of this yet. So this idea that you can compare a whole season of the flu to where we're at now, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I like that analogy because it helps me think about it, and it's also a baseball analogy. And you and I are big, we probably need to talk a little baseball before this is all over. I don't know about you, but that's certainly one of the depressing things about this is I'm missing the boys this summer.
You bet.
So yeah, so one of the things now that's just already happening, and it's going to happen even more so once this is over, is that. And I mean, I don't want to be snarky about it, but the gaslighting has started. So one of the things that you just said is we're already hearing people say, why were the models so off? When they first started, they were talking about 500,000 deaths or 350,000 deaths or whatever it was. And it's clearly not going to be that high. And just, in other words, it's a way to cast doubt on the competence of those who were of these models. So if someone says that to you, what's your response?
Well, I like the analogy from A Christmas Carol with Ebenezer Scrooge. And you have the ghost of Christmas future, and he walks him through all these terrible things that are in his future. And finally he appears at his grave. And Scrooge asks that question. He says, tell me that if I repent from the things that I've done, that this future doesn't exist. Surely if the deeds are departed from them, the future changes.
Yeah.
And to some degree, public health officials are the ghost of Christmas future. They aren't telling you what the future will be. They're telling you what the future will be if the present set of deeds continues on the course that it's going. If the deeds are departed from, then you get a different picture. So this is like saying that the ghost of Christmas future didn't have any impact on Scrooge because he turned out to be a nice guy anyway. Well, the reason he turned out to be a nice guy was because he saw what his future looked like and he changed his behavior accordingly. So yeah, somebody I remember recently was talking about, we have the crisis in New York, and so big deal there. We haven't had any crisis elsewhere. So what's the big deal about having to do all this social distancing and all of these practices that we're doing? Well, think about that for a second. What was the whole purpose of the social distancing and all the stuff that we're doing? So that we don't have crises. So the fact that you don't have crises is therefore evidence of the fact that the thing is working. that can be interpreted that way. So yeah, that's it. But this, I remember going back in graduate school 30 years ago that they talked about that this is, I would never want to be a public health official. If you get the model wrong and a lot more people die and you didn't press for significant action, then you're in deep weeds because you didn't sound the alarm loud enough and stuff didn't happen. If you do sound the alarm loud enough and strong enough to get the thing to happen, then everybody says, well, see, all the people you said were going to die didn't die anyway, so we didn't need to do all this. So as a public health official, you really are in a no-win situation trying to get the right response.
Yeah, yeah. I'll certainly say that I'm glad they're there, though.
Yes, amen.
They're certainly voices of wisdom and knowledge that I know our public health official here in Ohio has been wonderful. But even we've got some Republicans in the state legislature want to limit her authority because they want to open up businesses. So let's talk about that. So from what I'm hearing from you, that you think basically the lockdowns or the different things we've put in place for social distancing has been a good thing. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, I think they were necessary.
Yeah, and, maybe I shouldn't say good, a necessary thing. Yeah.
But and I just want to qualify that with saying, and this goes back to my risk factor issue.
Yeah.
I think it's possible that in a few months, a few weeks, once we have more information and we know more about the virus and we have the specifics of what happened, it's very possible we could conclude that it's possible that we did more than we needed to do based on what we know in November. Okay.
Right.
But the problem is we didn't know what we know in November in March. So the issue is the risk issue involved and managing risk. And if there's a significant chance, you have to err on the side of caution to prevent this situation.
So Sweden has been thrown out there because they haven't really, I mean, they haven't mandated things, but they've encouraged people. And some people have held Sweden up as the model. We need to be like Sweden. What interested me is that you posted something, I don't know, a few days ago, an article about how even though Sweden has not been mandating these things,
right?
When it comes to the economy, they're still suffering,
right?
And that the economic outlook isn't really much better than anyone else's. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the theory was, as I understand it, that Sweden wanted to. They're doing some measures. I mean, they did cancel school, I think, for younger people.
Didn't they? Aren't you the one that posted they put chicken manure in the? Was it chicken manure in the parks? So that the stink would keep people away. Was that it?
Keep people out of the park. They put chicken manure in the park and make it stink so bad that people wouldn't want to get
I mean, it's creative, isn't it?
Yeah, you talk about entrepreneurial, boy. They're on top of it.
Okay.
Now,
anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So anyway, I think the idea, the assumption is they felt the best way to do this was to get to herd immunity as quickly as possible, but also limit deaths as best they could. Some of the concerns early on was by not having as stringent social distancing and stay-at-home models, that type of thing, that their number of deaths could escalate considerably beyond other countries. I find Sweden a particularly interesting case because you have the other 4 Nordic countries that are in the area, all with similar, economic status, similar cultures, similar governments, that kind of thing. And Sweden's kind of doing it different from the others. And what you see is, I think Sweden has a number of fatalities have probably been about double Denmark's and probably more significantly above the other countries. Some have argued that was because their initial response, they had bad protocols for dealing with nursing homes or senior care facilities, and they have a disproportionately high number of people in those facilities. And so the policies going haven't necessarily been responsible for the higher death rate. So on the positive side, it does look like it hasn't been that much different in terms of the number of deaths. And we're still not through this, so we don't know what the ultimate total is. But the other piece of that is they were going to try to get to this herd immunity because that would allow them to bounce back better for the economy, and their economy wouldn't suffer as much. Mm-hmm. Well, their central bank put out a report just a few days ago that basically looking at the future using a good scenario and a bad scenario as to what they thought having a good scenario basically puts them at the same place as all their neighbors that are in Northern Europe there, and really shows no better, no worse. So I don't know that the Swedish model, and nobody knows at this point until we get to the end of this.
Right.
I don't know that the Swedish model is ultimately a success. It's interesting to watch to see what happens, but it's not the slam dunk alternative that I think a lot of people are trying to make it out to be.
Isn't that a reminder to us as well, to some extent, that the economy is definitely a global economy?
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah.
We're no longer in a situation where, it's primarily national. I mean, we just are global.
Right.
It's just the reality of globalization.
Sure.
Yeah. So, okay. So we've got things closed down. We're beginning to open, some states are beginning to open things up. Ohio's beginning a little bit.
Right.
There's no doubt people are hurting in this time. We've got some businesses that are gone. They will not come back.
Right.
We've got some people who will have different jobs, and we've got people right now who are struggling. And so for those who are saying we need to open up the economy, I mean, it's a fair concern.
It is.
Certainly
Absolutely
a fair concern. But it seems to me there's a couple things. Have you talked to? The first is that really a vital economy is always connected to the confidence of the consumer. Right? That's why there's a consumer confidence index.
Right.
So it isn't just a magical formula to open everything up and then everything's going to come roaring back. Talk a little bit about the need for consumer confidence to be there in order for the economy to start to return.
Right. I used to go back and look at the 1918 pandemic, and actually that's probably the nearest thing we have to something like what we're experiencing now. Obviously different worlds, some significantly different issues economically. They didn't have as good statistical data on the economy and deaths and things like that as we do now. But one of the things, looking at headlines that I saw in an article, I think it was by St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, they headlines to give you an indication of what was happening. And there would be headlines talking about, I think it was like Arkansas paper, Little Rock or something like that, said, I don't remember if it was a grocery store, big grocery store in Little Rock, saying that their number of their retail was down to 40% of what it had been, just a month earlier. And this company is saying they're down to 25%. This company says we're barely bringing in, 30% of the sales that we had some time ago. These places had no shutdown. There was no government order that people couldn't go shopping there.
Yeah.
The issue was that people were in fear of what happened if they went out in public and tried to buy things. So the idea that you're just going to lift all these restrictions and then we're going to go roaring back to 85 or 90% of where we were, I think that's fantasy. It's going to be a while before a lot of people come back to having confidence in it. Right now, without testing and without being able to manage the process to find out how the disease is progressing by opening up the economy, I think there is good reason to be, concerned about going out and mixing in big public settings. So I don't know. Yeah.
And along with that, so the two are connected together, and I think that makes perfect sense. So you and I are both free market fans.
Yep.
In some Christian circles, particularly certain mainline circles, we probably shouldn't say that, but we're both mainliners, so we're out there.
Heresy.
Having gone on the record to say we think free markets are all in all pretty good, and that they do actually open up a level of prosperity that other markets have not. Fair. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean we don't believe in sensible regulation of them, because greed is always a problem, right? However, we're in an interesting time. And so the question I ask you is there a place and a role for government really to take a very significant role in trying to assist those who find themselves without income in this time? I know that there's 3 or 4 Democrats in the House that has suggested a $2,000 paycheck to everybody for the next 6 months, to be extended maybe to a year if necessary. I think that has no chance of passing the Senate, but it's out there. I mean, that's not something we would want in normal times. But is that something that makes sense in this time?
Yeah, and I think it's a complicated question, and we could probably talk for a couple hours about nuancing, all the specifics of this. I think first of all, from a more 30,000-foot level of looking at the economy and the economic impact of this, going back to the 1918 model again and looking at that, if you consider that when that pandemic hit, I believe there were 700,000 deaths in the United States over about 1.5, 2 year period, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to increase that as the proportionally based on how big the United States is today, that'd be like over 2 million people dying. Okay. The other interesting thing about that pandemic is those people that died were primarily people, I shouldn't say primarily, but the biggest bulk of them were ages 18 to 40 years old. So they were much younger than the people that are dying today. And the pandemic came right at the end of World War I, where you had already had economic devastation going on. And so you had weakened economy, both in the United States and in Europe. And if you go back and look at the economic impact of what had happened with that pandemic, and you put it on charts, it looks like a little poop, and then you're right back where it was. I mean, it recovers almost instantly.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the GDP numbers, it barely even looks like there's hardly a dip in the GDP numbers through that time. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to have exactly that, but I think this pandemic is different than something like the Great Depression or the Great Recession that we had. Some have talked about referring to this as the Great Cessation as opposed to the Great Recession.
Mm.
What we've had, the depression and the Great Recession were largely demand-driven economic collapses. Demand began to fall off, and so because nobody was buying things, then companies end up going down. You get the spiraling going down. In this case, it's a supply-driven issue. Because of the virus, we've had to stop the supply side of the economy, which then means some companies can't afford to keep employees, and so cutting wages, and so then you get some of the demand aspect. So it's a little bit different model in terms of how we look at past economies. And I think this is again, nobody knows, but I think we will probably experience, and within 2 or 3 years from now, we'll look back, and I think this is going to look something more like 1918 than a lot of us expected. Okay. That the economy will come back relatively quickly. But in the short term, that's not to discount the pain in the short term that is occurring. This thing is definitely going to impact people that are lower income, the more vulnerable people in society at a more significant rate, both in terms of healthcare, because not getting adequate healthcare, you're seeing that minority communities and poor folks are the ones who are getting harder hit by the medical impact of this. Yeah. As well as many of them are in service industries. And those, of course, are the ones that are being hit hard because restaurants, entertainment venues, that type of thing, where a lot of people, retail establishments, that's where a lot of lower income people are working, and obviously they are not employed right now. I saw today that I think the unemployment was like 33 million people or something like that. But it's interesting, in the survey that they had, they said that 77% of those people thought that they were going to be rehired in a relatively near term. Now, they may be wrong, but the optimism is there that some of this is coming back. The companies that were already on the edge, this is likely going to send some of them over the edge, and so particular companies are going to go. Individual industries, this is going to, it's not going to have the same impact on every industry. Some are going to do very well, some are going to do poorly, some it's not going to matter that much. So I think it's hard to estimate what the overall impact of the economy is in terms of where it's going to end up. So 2 questions, I'll separate into two things here. One is, we're talking about people, particularly people that are low income and that are vulnerable. Absolutely. This is a unique situation. This is not a market failure of some kind that is leading to this situation. It's not bad business decisions that have somehow resulted in the situation. It's a natural disaster.
Yeah.
And so in a natural disaster, yes, I think it's appropriate for the government to come in, and particularly for those that are low income, to make sure that they are supported. And I think one of the aspects, I'm not sure if it's strong enough, but one of the things in the stimulus bill was the idea of encouraging companies not to fire employees, only to have to hire people back later. They were giving tax credits and various types of things that people, they try to keep their employees on, and at least at a percentage of salary. I think that speeds up the recovery, and it's better for those employees if they can stay connected to their company and then pick up as this thing unfolds, rather than having mass firings and then the whole economy being in churn, people trying to get jobs back and that type of thing. So, yeah, I think that, yes, I think there is a place for the government in doing that. I think that on the downside is some of the stimulus given in the economy, trying to get the businesses going. You needed that. Let me say that up front. I think you needed that. The concern is that having pumped so much money in the economy, that if this thing begins to take off quickly and you have that much money floating around the economy, you run the risk of inflation, some very high inflation. And I think that's one of the things that worries people in the relatively near term is that could happen. More long term, what we're doing is we're now increasing also the national debt. And the national debt as a percentage of GDP, we're already over, I think we're something like 105 or 110% of GDP for the national debt. I think the high that we had was in World War II, where we had 121% of national debt over GDP. And if you keep adding that, you're putting an elephant on the back of the economy in terms of being able to function in the future and limiting what we can do in the future.
You wonder where also that's going to go, because I recently read George Will's book, The Conservative Sensibility. It's a wonderful big book. If you want to plot through 600 pages, he argues for Madisonian democracy as opposed to Wilsonian democracy, and it's Will, so it's a very thought-provoking read. But one of the things that he says very clearly in the book is he said, there's no incentive for either side, either party, to reduce spending and reduce the deficit.
Yeah.
There's just no incentive. And
Right.
The only time they want to talk about fiscal responsibility is when they're not in power.
Exactly.
When they're the party not in power, all of a sudden we need to exercise fiscal responsibility. When they've got the purse strings, look out. And the concern that is for me is that means that we're heading down this road, and it's only going to stop when there is some kind of major disaster that a future generation is going to have to shoulder.
Right. That's very possible. I mean, I don't know what will eventually motivate people to press their political leaders to begin to tackle the problem.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues, I should mention this in terms of the economic impact, both economic and the well-being impact for people in our country right now. I think this does highlight what an atrocious state that our healthcare system is in. And I think it is, at this late date, I think it is still, I don't know what the right word is, it's wrong that we still have the health insurance and the health system that we have, where it's tied to employers, and you lose your job, you lose your health care. Our health care is like twice the cost of other countries. I'm not advocating for a United Kingdom style socialized medicine model. I think there are other models, but there should be universal health insurance and universal coverage. I think if you had that in a situation like we're in now, you would have better health care, better health coverage, and I think that you would have less anxiety in the marketplace for people, and you probably have greater mobility because people would not be worried about switching from one place. If they lose their job, they're going to lose their health care, that type of thing. I don't want to go into all the weeds. That can be a whole nother discussion.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the healthcare situation is terrible, and
yeah.
I think part of the problem has been is that in America we and it's not just in this subject, but we always it's dichotomies, one or the other.
Right.
So we've got two choices. You've either got socialism and single payer, or you've got employer-based capitalism. And
Right.
we know that there's, Europe, not all of Europe is single payer. France is not, Germany is not, but yet they've got 90% of their people are covered.
Exactly.
And so, what I think is frustrating is that I think it's because of politicians in power and who want to keep it, and people who the electorate. We just don't really want to have what I call a grown-up discussion about this, because this matters. People are hurting,
Yeah. Right.
And so anyway, that's a little off the subject, but it is also connected, because you are right to say that people who do not have access to adequate health care are the ones going to suffer in this time the most.
Yeah.
So we all have all right. Michael, I appreciate this time, and thank you. I've got just one more question, and that is, do you think we'll see baseball before the summer is out?
I doubt it.
Yeah.
I can't imagine them bringing that back. The one possibility, I haven't watched a game yet, but I hear on ESPN in the early hours of the morning now, they're showing the games from South Korea, where
yes,
they got
the
stadium's completely empty, but they got the players playing. I want to see how that works. If we could do that, I might be for it.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, I know they're talking July, but I think the first time we get a player who tests positive for COVID-19, some $6 million player, $7 million player, that'll be the end of that,
Right.
probably. So
yeah, well, just that many people in the stands. There's no way in these larger venues that you can really do the distancing you need in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. But could be wrong.
Never
We'll
know.
see. Yeah.
Well, Michael, I appreciate this time. Thank you for the great insight. And
Sure.
when this is all over and I get to Kansas City, we'll have barbecue. I'll buy.
You bet. I'm
All
looking
right.
forward to it. It'd be great.
All right. Right, my friend. Thank you, and take care.
Thank you so much.
All right. And everybody have a good day.
Goodbye.